Be sure to go to flipsidegaming.com and use promo code 6 for 10% off on orders over $10. Do the same at the Grizzly Gentleman for 10% off at checkout. Both of them are great deals and they help support the show. What is up, Planeswalkers? The last episode where we talk about individual cards before we start getting into the actual deck lists and things and whatnot. Today we're going to be going over 5s, 6s, and lands. I don't have any 7s here. You'll kind of see why once we get there. However, I did want to mention Forbidding Spirit, as this is one of the cards that someone had commented about. The main reason I didn't discuss Forbidding Spirit is because although it does have a decent body and a really nice effect, it's only for one turn, man. And like that one turn can absolutely win you the game. But when I was thinking about this card, I was going through the whole like, if like the place I want to play this is against like essentially an Embercleave deck, and those decks are just going to kill you like anyway. Like, I don't know. I mean, this card is definitely reasonable. If you're going up against a lot of aggro in the meta, this is definitely a reasonable sideboard slot. It has too much competition in the main deck to be a main deckable card, but it does slow down the aggro decks by about a turn. But they do have to be kind of just like creature aggro decks. Obviously, if your opponent is running a lot of burn spells, then this card doesn't help you as much as just having a card that ETB is to draw a card, right? Like, generally speaking, I prefer Inspiring Cleric over this, because the Cleric is going to gain you 4 and still have essentially the same body to block with. For what it's worth, Cleric does die to Shock. This doesn't. But a part of me just likes the guaranteed life gain as opposed to the potential life gain. So then we get into the actual 5s and 6s, and you're going to be hearing me say the same thing a lot. It just costs too much. Oftentimes, when we're playing Death and Taxes, we are trying to have a lot of early game creatures that can come down, tilt your opponent, essentially, get them off of what they were trying to do, and at the same time, slowly whittle them down. Once we get to kind of the 5 drops, while those cards are still good, 5s and up, I should say, their effects on the board have to be very drastic in order for them to kind of be worth the potential of being in the early game, like clogging up your hand, when you would rather have one of your creatures that is going to tax your opponent. That said, there are 5 drops that are going to be better than others, and I'll try my best to point those out. Angel of Grace is very interesting insofar as it does allow you to just not die against certain decks, especially when you are running a lot of blink effects. Being able to repeatedly get value out of Angel of Grace is quite nice. She does have Flash, which is fantastic. She is a flying threat still, and you can use her from your graveyard, which is quite nice. That said, the matches where you typically want to use something like this, against aggro, for example, you very likely can just die before turn 5, like before you even get a chance to cast this. And so I would much prefer, if this card were in my opening hand, for it to be something else. It can potentially help you out against like combo kills that involve burn, so if your opponent has something like 1,000 Year Storm. But even then, like, they're likely going to be able to put you down to 1, and then on their upkeep, hit you with the extra shock that they have in hand. So you'll have to also have like an instant speed way to bounce this. So yeah, just generally speaking, it doesn't do as much as it could. Archon of Justice is a card that I absolutely love in EDH. Being able to just exile something when it dies is great. 5 mana 4/4 flyer is actually is like sadly not even good stats anymore for actual constructed play, which is unfortunate. I absolutely love this art. Jason Chan does a great job. But yeah, it doesn't do something as it comes down, and only does something when it dies. So for that reason alone, it just is way too slow. Baneslayer Angel kind of does something as soon as she comes down, insofar as she is a huge body that can snowball out of control very fast. First Strike, Flying, and Lifelink are fantastic. The protections from Demons and Dragons will come in handy sometimes. But being able to just beat stick against some aggro decks can be nice. It suffers from very similar issues that Angel of Grace suffers from, except the difference is that Angel of Grace, like if you have that in your hand, but you're not close to being at 1, she's not as good. Whereas with Baneslayer Angel, you can play her as soon as you want, and she'll immediately start getting value for you against these aggressive decks. For that reason, I do value Baneslayer Angel a little higher. However, I'm more inclined to not have her because I would rather not have her clog my hands in the early game. Bishop of Rebirth, though, is a card I've come so close to playing in so many different scenarios. As a 5-mana 3/4, she has Vigilance, cool. Her body is just too small for me to really ever get her past the cutting room floor. If she was a 2/5, it'd be better. If she was a 1/6, it'd be the best. Because all we want out of a creature like this is to survive, and as a 4 toughness creature, she very rarely can. If you can get essentially any of your creatures back. As I've said several times, the majority of the cards in this deck are 3 or less, so having that kind of Sun Titan ability is quite nice. But notice, it's not actually the Sun Titan ability. You can only get creature cards, so you can't rebuy Tormod's Crypts. You can't, well, whatever, it's fine. But you can't rebuy these other things. You can't get your lands back in order to continue Ghost Quartering. So it's just restrictive enough on the ability, and the toughness is just low enough that I can't ever justify actually playing this card. But she's definitely on the fringe. The art's fantastic for what it's worth. And like, if someone were playing this and succeeded with it, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be as surprised as if they were playing some other cards in this list. Cavalier of Dawn is quite nice, and the reason it's quite nice is it's essentially universal removal. They do get a 3/3, but different to Angelic Ascension or whatever it's called, a 3/3 on the ground, especially since it's an artifact and a token, is a lot less worrisome than a 4/4 in the air. So being able to just yeet a creature or planeswalker like Ascension does, but also being able to get rid of an artifact or enchantment is quite nice. It's a 4/6 with Vigilance, which means that its body, like a 5-mana 4/6 Vigilance, that's a decent body, right? That's something that we can work with. It can trade nicely. It can also just block nicely. And when it dies, you get to return an artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hands. Now, for what it's worth, we're not necessarily going to be playing a ton in the main deck. However, there are some artifact creatures that we've talked about. There are some enchantment creatures that we've talked about. We've talked about several artifacts or enchantments that are great sideboard options. So this is a decent option, especially if you're running cards that can blank your opponents having creature tokens. So, for example, in the Azorius deck, if you wanted to run this, you can, where you destroy something of your opponent's, who cares what it is, and you can, like, Deputy of Detention that token. Then you can flicker it, say with Thassa, for example, to reset it and actually exile some real thing that they have. Maybe instead of doing that, you flicker your Cavalier of Dawn, now before you Deputy of Detention. Now they have 2 of these 3/3s. Your Cavalier gets to block the first one for essentially free. You play your Deputy, you get rid of both of those tokens, right? So this card definitely has room to work within the format of Death and Taxes, because it does give you essentially a decent body, pretty good removal, and it allows you to recoup some of your potential sideboard cards that you may have lost either via discarding, counterspells, etc., etc. Elspeth Conquers Death is not a creature. It's a decent tax card. You get rid of something. Usually these are things that you're going to actually want to get rid of once you get to this point in the game. Things with CMC 3 or more. It forces your opponents to spend more for things, which is quite nice, and you get a creature back. That's all great. It's not a creature, and as such, I do not like it as much as something like Cavalier. God Eternal Oketra is also quite nice. It's more similar to Cavalier than it is to something like Baneslayer. Yes, this is a really nice attacker, right? It has double strike, and it's a 3/6 for 5. That's quite nice. But what I really like about this card is the fact that unless it gets countered, essentially, it will come back again and again and again. And there's no hoops that you have to jump through in order to do this, right? You don't have to be playing Luminous Broodmoth or Shepherd or any of these other cards that are going to be able to return creatures from your graveyard. This has its own innate recursion by putting it back into the deck. And you get value off of just casting a lot of creatures, which is what we're doing anyway, especially considering that the majority of our creatures are relatively inexpensive. If we play a Gargoth Catcher on turn 5, and then on turn 6 we play, even like we flash in Aven Mind Sensor and blow up one of our opponent's lands, right? We have, let's say they wrathed us on turn 4. So now we just have Ketra, a 2/1 flyer, and a 4/4 with Vigilance. That board alone is worthy of another board wipe. So we don't have to commit anything more to the board. But if we do, our Ketra is going to come back. And if they just have single target removal on our taxed creatures, for example, we still are going to have those 4/4 black zombies. Because it's on cast, we also don't care if our creatures get countered. I definitely like Ketra, but I find that she often, once again, hits the cutting room floor because I would prefer to not have this in the early games against a number of decks. Lyra, she's like Baneslayer Angel, except she is legendary, which is bad because we can't have multiple. For what it's worth, that's not going to matter too often. And technically speaking, she doesn't have protection from demons and dragons. I know technically that's just like extra text, like flavor text on there, but it comes into effect a non-zero amount of times. So I guess like the thing that Lyra has against Baneslayer is that Lyra can't get cast down, although typically that's not what I'm seeing in Historic as black removal. So the other angels you control, it essentially does not matter. Trapdraw Tyrant is not a card that I've even tried, although I wanted to talk about it because it has an interesting effect. 5 mana for a 5/5 Dino, sure, that's kind of whatever. That's the base stats, like that's the minimum stats we kind of are looking at. When it's dealt damage, you get to exile a creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. If you're able to consistently protect your Tyrant, then it's fine. But consider the situation in which you're just like taking a bunch of their creatures and then the board gets wiped somehow. And then all of a sudden your opponent has just a flood of dudes. Not the best. For what it's worth, this does work very nicely in conjunction with Containment Priest. Yes. So they would enter the battlefield, right? Let's say Trapjaw Tyrant dies. In response, you flash in Containment Priest. Their creatures would enter the battlefield again. However, Containment Priest is like, no. So it does have some nice synergy if you can get it to work. However, it's just too slow, in my opinion. Venerated Loxodon can buff up your creatures a little bit, but it doesn't do anything besides that. So I don't even give it the time of day. Chandra, we skipped blue and black. I don't think there were any 5-drop blue or black creatures that I really wanted to consider. There's the other Cavaliers. The Black Cavalier, I guess I should talk about the Black Cavalier. This is what, I forgot this one. Cavalier of Dusk, maybe? Cavalier of Night, whatever. The Black Cavalier is technically a decent option. You get to sacrifice a creature and destroy a creature. Has lifelink, that's nice. When it dies, you can get back one of your threats. It's similar to Bishop in that I've said most of our deck is 3 or less. But the reason I wasn't initially going to talk about this card is 1, it has triple black pips, and 2, we're not always going to have something to sacrifice, so it's not always going to be removal. That is kind of okay because the lifelink is helpful, and the fact that if our opponent does wipe the board, we can just grab one of our things back. Yeah, okay, I can kind of see this card being a little better than I initially gave it credit for. The blue one doesn't matter. There's really nothing in blue at 5 that I considered worth talking about. Chandra. Excuse me. Her first plus kind of helps against just not drawing things that you need. Her second plus allows you to hit things, but she's a planeswalker and she costs 5. Terror of the Peaks is interesting. Its body's fine. It has a tax effect in that when your opponents want to remove it with a single target thing, then it costs them 3 life to do so. But what's really interesting is that it's very similar to Ketra in that you get some benefit from just playing some other creatures. Even though our creatures are relatively small, just pinging our opponent, or even like planeswalkers our opponent has, for 1, 2, 3 damage on each of our creatures entering the battlefield is just generally okay. That said, I still haven't tried this in the red-white version. I haven't played the red-white version since the very last video I made on it, so I don't even think I've tested any of the newer cards, not just the Zendikar Rising cards. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is worthy of a slot, but it's not something that I've used, and I think it's still probably too slow. Biogenic Ooze is funny because it's a one-man army. One of the things that you'll see when we get to some of the other cards is that I really do like the one-man armies at 5, because they mitigate some of the issues with the 5-drops in so far as, like, if they come down and then immediately die, like, what do you have out of it? What's nice about Biogenic Ooze is it comes down, you get a consolation prize of having a 2/2 Ooze. So, it's okay. It's kind of nice in a green ETB thing. You can grab it off of Militia Bugler, which is also something that should be taken into account. But generally speaking, it's like the other 5-drops. I would rather have other things in my hand that I can use. Cavalier of Thorns is nice because it has reach, but the first ability doesn't matter all that much. Having extra lands, especially once we already get to 5, is not really what the Death and Taxes deck needs. And then, like, the second ability being, well, technically the third ability, but whatever, being able to exile this to get back a specific card might help in a specific matchup, although I'm inclined to prefer just Cavalier of Dawn, because oftentimes, if we're looking for a very specific thing, especially if it's a sideboard card, it's likely going to be an artifact or enchantment. Elder Gargoth is a really strong card generally. It does a lot of things. It's similar to Questing Beast, that's the reason for its inclusion. It just does so many things. That said, none of those things are inherently Death and Taxes-y, and unlike Questing Beast, this does not have haste, so you can cast it, and it just dies, and you are playing a card that can just get stuck in your early hand. Tensure Dryad, you can get it with Bugler. It's a one creature army, although for what it's worth, it does take a little while to get that army. Other than that, it's not the best. Thrag Tusk. This card is great. You can't get it with Bugler, which is meh. It ETBs, you gain 5. If it leaves, it doesn't have to die. If it leaves, you have a beast. Fantastic card. Technically speaking, not really a Death and Taxes card, but if you were trying to play a 5-drop and you're running a bunch of ETB style things, I guess in a deck like that, it's a little bit closer to, like, Selesnya Hate Bears. In that deck, you might actually use like Llanowar Elf or something, but it just does so many nice things. Just imagine, like, flickering this thing with Charming Prince, right? It's game over, man. Game over. Tolsmir can't be grabbed with Bugler, but it does great things. You get a green wolf that enters the battlefield, fights a thing, gain 3 life. It's very nice. However, whenever I run a Selesnya 5-drop, I typically will be running Tristani. Tristani is a 1-creature army, buffs your whole squad. If your opponent happens to be stealing your things, you get them back, which is quite nice. And she can get got by Bugler. Vona, Butcher of Magan, she allows you to have, like, actual removal, but she's 5 mana instant tap ability, so it's very possible you're going to cast her and then she's going to die, so she's not the best. Yorion Sky Nomad. Now, I've not gotten a chance to play this as a companion in an 80-card Death and Taxes list. Because there are so many potential good ETB triggers across even just the blue splash, but in a Yorion deck you might be going Bant, I could see a situation in which that deck is okay. The reason I say that deck is okay is because you really are going to want to make sure you can hit very specific cards in, like, essentially a very specific order. So I'm not sure if the benefit of playing Yorion outweighs the detriment of losing a bit of your consistency because you have to run a higher count of cards. That said, you can technically mitigate that somewhat by just playing a ton of 4-drops, or 4 Ubs, I should say. But I have tried this in the blue-white, like, flicker version, the blink version that happened to run Thassa, and it was fine. Like, it was just good. 5 mana 4/5 that gets to exile any number of your non-land things can be just decimating to your opponent. Also, Yorion is adorable. Probably my favorite visually of the companions. If you, like, zoom in on this art, it's just a happy little, like, narwhal bird. So cute. Azura the Lawbringer. It is very annoying for your control opponents. We're getting 6 drops now. Very annoying for your control opponent to deal with. At ETBs, they can't cast instant sorcery spells during their next turn, which is nice, but it costs 6 mana. You do have the whole Sphinx's Revelation on attack, but, you know, we're not protecting this thing with counter spells. We're not denying our opponent of so many resources that we can afford to just cast this, so it's not great. Godbearer Statue is an artifact. You can technically run it in a version that has things that can maybe ramp you into this, having like a Karn board, so you can kind of just run this in the sideboard and say, hey, if I happen to flood out, I can grab this and make my opponent's stuff cost more, and then of course ping them down. But that's kind of the only context I see that in. You really, in my opinion, don't want this in like a main board scenario. Ugin the Ineffable, very similar to the previous. If there's kind of an Eldrazi taxes build that utilizes a lot of colorless spells, I could maybe see playing this as like a 1-of in the main deck. It does mitigate some of your issues of card advantage because the +1 ability is quite nice, and you can just use its -3 to get rid of essentially anything that you need to get rid of. But other than that kind of specific context, it costs too much. Now we're getting to lands. As I said, there would not be very many 5s or 6s because the majority of the time it's just they cost too much and they can clog up your opening hands, or your early hands. I don't like Ancient Ziggurat in the majority of Death and Taxes decks. I've had a number of people kind of ask why I haven't been playing them, and the main reason is, although we're playing essentially just a ton of creatures, they're very relatively few non-creatures in the vast majority of the Death and Taxes lists I've put out so far. The reason I don't like it is because it takes up land slots that could be used for utility lands, right? Since you can't use this to pay for the utility aspect of some of these utility lands, Field of Ruin, you can't use these for any of the cycle lands. If you want to use some of the castles, you can't use this for that. It just makes the deck needlessly worse, especially when you're only doing a 1-color splash, right? If you're playing just the white-blue deck, the deck list isn't going to be difficult to build a land base for. Right, the main portion of the deck is going to be mono white. You're going to have some blue here and there, even if you have double pips of blue. Since you're just a 2-color deck, you can play your best white-blue cards. You know, your shocks, your checks, and maybe the cycly one from Amonkhet, I think. I don't remember any of these damn lands. But you can play that. You can maybe play a couple other cycles, or instead of that, you play some utility lands, a Scavenging Ground or something like that. We'll get to some more of the utility lands in a second. But if you play Ancient Ziggurat, yes, technically, you're making it a little bit easier to go like turn 1 blue card, turn 2 double white card, turn 3 double blue card. Like, probably in the majority of cases that probably isn't going to be an issue with the mana base that I just described, and that's why I just don't like Ancient Ziggurat for a deck like this. If you're running like heavy pipped 3-color Death and Taxes, then yes, absolutely run Ancient Ziggurat, but otherwise, like, this is relegated to like the multiple colored humans decks that are historic that need to die. Bojuka Bog is not just a great card for the black version, because obviously you get free graveyard hate in the main deck, but also this can be a 1 or 2 of in the Maverick version. I'm probably just like using that deck title wrong, but I don't care. Where you have the Knight of the Reliquary and some of the other ways of getting lands back from your graveyard. You can do stupid things like Ghost Quarter this, and then like replay it if you have like a Remnant of Excavator or something like that. They're shenanigansy, but it's still something that you can utilize. Honestly, like, even in mono white builds, if you just have like if you have the room for this card, you can just get people with it. It does come in tapped, and it doesn't tap for white, but if your mana base essentially allows for it, there's very little reason not to use it. Arden Veil, if you're mono white, oftentimes this is just going to be a normal white land. Sometimes you just get to make guys with it. It's nice. Rebirth is not nearly as strong as something like Arden Veil. We're typically not going to be wanting to devote mana and like a turn to use this thing's ability. The +1 damage is not going to matter across the majority of the game, so Rebirth, not as good. Garenbrig, if you're going for a more like Hate Bear style that is running a higher proportion of 4s, 5s, even a 6 or something, then Garen Break is decent. That said, it does only make green, so you will have to factor that in to the rest of your mana base if you're the white-green version. I've not used it, I haven't had the need to, but I might in the future. Lock Flame draws cards. It's fine for that reason alone. It can just be one of the lands and the black version, and if you get to a situation where you just need to draw more cards, this does that for you. Cards of Interest. It's Scries. It's essentially very similar in the blue version, except the reason the white-blue version has a bit of a leg up against the white-black version's land is because in that deck you also have a lot of flash creatures. So if you don't end up needing those creatures, you can use that that mana and turn to scry. Field of Ruin. It destroys things. It's kind of like Tech Edge. I mean, it's different. They're different. It taps for mana. Sure, who cares? You can sack it to destroy a non-basic land, and each of you get to search your library for a basic. You love this card when you have Aven Mindcenter out, or your opponent is playing a very greedy deck. You hate this card when your opponent is not playing a very greedy deck, and or they have a lot of landfall triggers. Ghost Quarter is like Field of Ruin, except Ghost Quarter can hit basics for what it's worth, and you don't have to pay any mana to use it. That said, you don't get to search for a land. So if your opponent, is on like a 3-color deck and they only have one of a certain source, and you have Aven Mindcenter, then like Ghost Quarter essentially can be a strip mine, but sometimes it's just not. So, Idyllic Grange. It's okay. You can it's not too much of a commitment if you're playing mono white. Although frankly, I prefer to play these cycle lands, which I didn't actually put up on here because I'm stupid. But essentially, like, you get to have kind of a free, hey, my Thalia's a 3/2 now, she's a little bit harder to kill. It's a plains, which might matter in certain circumstances, but generally speaking, I prefer to use the cycle lands. Scavenger Grounds. It's a colorless version of Bojuka Bog that you have to use, but whereas Bojuka Bog only hits your opponent's things, or a target player, this hits all of them. So in the Maverick version, it's usually worse to have Scavenger Grounds, just because you often are going to want to use your graveyard for that. But in decks where you don't need that, this is just okay. I guess the other difference is that this is a sacrifice, whereas Bojuka Bog just comes in. So you don't have to lose Bojuka Bog where you do have to lose Scavenger Grounds. Alright, so before we actually get to those, let's see, what's it, Scattered Grove, I think? Bro, I know cards too well. Scattered Grove and its ilk are pretty decent. They are fine with the checks, and they are just cycling. They do enter tapped, which can be annoying, but depending on the speed of of your deck, you can kind of get away with running a couple of these in your splashes, because flooding out can happen, and it's really annoying when it does. So having a card that you can just say, no, I'm going to get rid of this and try to get something else is quite nice. The same goes for, I think it's Secluded Step is the white version. Yep. Man, I are so smart. Secluded Step, if you're playing the mono white version, or you don't want the multicolored one for some reason, then Step can also be a consideration. Getting into the Zendikar cards, Angel of Destiny, we're not planning on gaining a bunch of life. I mean, it's pretty much that's it. We're not trying to gain a bunch of life, so this doesn't make sense here, but someone might have said, why didn't you talk about it? Emiria's Call. This one is interesting. You can play it as an untapped land, but the reason why I'm considering this card in the mono white version is because sometimes it's just a land, right? Sometimes it's just a land. Sometimes you're going to have to pay 3 in order to do things on curve properly, but it has the chance of just giving you an insane turn late in the game, right? If you're flooding out and you're able to just cast this, you make your squad indestructible, so you and it's until your next turn, so your opponent can't board wipe anything but your angels. You can even just attack in and not worry about the crackback because you have these 2 angels. It feels good, but it's new and I haven't played with it yet. Ancient Greed Warden maybe goes in that the version with Night of Autumn. The reason I say maybe is because we do have Remunap Excavator, and I'm not sure how often we're going to want this specific ability here. I guess with the idyllic range, because this is a plains, you can sacrifice it with Knight of the Reliquary. Reliquary says sack a forest or a plains. You can theoretically have this enter, put a counter on something, sack it with Knight of the Reliquary, go grab something, who cares? And then if you have Ancient Greedwarden out, and you haven't played your lands, maybe this is the following turn, you can play that Grange again, get another counter, sacrifice it again, and you can have this kind of loop type thing going. So I get, there's also the food one. So, I mean, that is a consideration for sure. Oh, right, I should say you get double. Like, you would get double counters. So, there's definitely a consideration for that. Yeah, I mean, there's a consideration. The main issue is just that this is 6 mana. It has reach, which is nice. It's a 5/7, which is nice. It's just, is it worth running even in that deck? And it might be. I saw LVD do a hate boars deck. Honestly, I think he only played the one boar, but whatever. But he utilized Knight of the Reliquary alongside Sneck, Lotus Cobra, and he was able to do some really wonky things, and he could do them relatively early as well. So if you're running Lotus Cobra alongside Knight of the Reliquary and this, then you can probably have an interesting Maverick style game going on. Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I don't think LVD's deck ran enough interesting one-off lands, but still. Then we have the pathways that have another color. They're worth potentially running. Crawling Barrens is... Oh, wait, this is another pathway. It's supposed to be over there. Crawling Barrens is a man lands. We don't have very other creature lands that we can work with, and this one is relatively expensive. That said, it's something we can do potentially, but we'd rather have something like Mutavault or Mishra's Factory? I can't remember which one it is, but the one that just turned itself into a 2/2. Yeah, so that is it for the cards that are currently on Historic. I might do... Well, the thing is... Well, no, if you look at all of the Zendikar cards, there were a decent number that I at least talked about, so I might do this with each new set that comes out, is just have a video where it's, I'm talking about the Death in Texas cards, but tomorrow's video is most likely going to be a number of decks for each of the color combinations, if I have the time. It might come the following day, but we are essentially at the end of the primer of Death in Texas. I just have to talk about the decks, and because I am a lazy bum, I might get someone else to to write all of my thoughts down from these videos. I'd probably pay him. I'd pay him. But write all my thoughts down and then publish that somewhere. But I'm not sure if I'm going to do that. Regardless, I really hope you've enjoyed this. I really like Death in Texas, as you can probably tell, considering I've talked for this is what, the 5th one, so each of those were at least an hour. So I've talked for nearly a workday. And the reason I say nearly is because I'm including what I have to talk about for the decks as well. I've talked for a workday on these, and that's just how much I've talked. That's not about going through and actually getting all of these cards and all that stuff. So I really like Death in Texas. I hope you do as well. I'd like to thank my lovely patrons, especially Fogwind. They really do allow me to do stuff like this. I'm very passionate about. And if you'd like to see more of this type of thing, you can find links to support me in the description, or you can just like, comment, subscribe on the video. Share it around to your friends. All of that stuff really, really does help. Yeah. Until next time, all will be one.